The shuttle banked low over Sereth Veen on the morning of the session, and I got my first clear look at the capital from the port window, a city built to hold 1,000 species, and suddenly unsure if it could hold itself together. I have been told that in ordinary times, Sereth Veen reads from the air as something between elegant and enormous, all that layered blue stone catching the morning light. What it read that morning was neither of those things. The architecture was Vithari in the way that all architecture on their worlds is Vithari. Layered, curved, every surface a deliberate echo of the hive lattice, their distant ancestors carved into the karst ridges of the original homeworld. Blue stone ribbed like a thorax. Arched spans grown rather than poured, or that's what the briefing notes claimed, which I'd read twice on the transit and once more in the shuttle because I had 11 hours of travel and 3 documents of actual use, and I wanted to know the people I was walking into before I sat in their chamber and said almost nothing. The Vithari themselves, the ones visible through the window as we came down over the approach lanes, moved fast. Not panicked, not quite, but the city had the particular quality of a place where the news had arrived ahead of the solutions, and the population had not yet decided what to do with that gap. You could see it in how they clustered at transit nodes, in the way vehicles queued too tightly and then too loosely. I have been in 6 postings across 14 years, and every civilization I've watched from the air during a crisis has this same quality. The surface motion increases while the underlying motion slows, which is the signature of a population that is spending energy it would normally use for deliberation on movement that does not quite know where it is going. A city holding its breath. The Vithari version of it was quiet from altitude. They are not a loud species. They produce sounds in register ranges that outsiders don't fully perceive, but the visual signature was unmistakable. I was the Earth military liaison to the Vithari Compact. That is the formal title. What the title means in practice is that I was the lowest-ranking member of any delegation that could plausibly speak for Earth's military posture, and I had been assigned to this posting 11 months ago under a routine exchange arrangement, before the Korath ascendancy had taken the first of the outer systems, before anyone was paying particular attention to whether the Compact and Earth maintained a warm channel. At the time it had been a career lateral, 3 years of treaty maintenance, trade corridor monitoring, the occasional joint exercise communique. Good filing practice. Nothing operationally interesting. The Korath had made it operationally interesting. I want to be careful here about what the Korath are, because in the months since the session I've read 6 separate species profiles, and none of them quite gets at what it felt like to sit in the Vithari Emergency Assembly Hall and watch the chamber process the intelligence summaries that preceded the formal petition. The Korath ascendancy is old. Not ancient civilization old in the way some species use that word as a polite shorthand for stagnant. The Korath had been expanding, steadily, for 400 years, which is a different quality of old. 4 centuries of methodical advance. They had a doctrine, and the doctrine was patience applied with precision. Take one corridor, consolidate it completely, let the adjacent species recalibrate their models, then advance again before the recalibration was finished. They were not in a hurry. They had taken 3 of the Compact's outer systems in 11 months, and in Korath terms that was relatively brisk. Intelligence suggested they were accelerating. The reason I had the profile and the history is that Earth's liaison architecture in this theater had been running a Korath watch for 9 years. Well before I arrived at Sereth Veen, and well before anyone was describing the situation as a crisis. The corridor exposure modeling that the Corvith Station analysts had built over that period was detailed enough that, when the Vasith-Kalar corridor fell, the threshold flag in the model had already been sitting at amber for 6 weeks. It crossed to red on the 4th, when the consolidated movement pattern confirmed the ascendancy's intent to push to the next system. The analysts at Corvith sent me the flag on the 4th. I read it on the 4th, reviewed the supporting data, checked the force availability survey that Corvith Command maintains on a rolling quarterly basis, and wrote the first draft of the deployment order the same afternoon. I filed the final authorization on the 11th, which was the day the routing confirmed transit window alignment. None of this felt urgent from the inside. That is the thing about watching a corridor for 9 years. The urgency gets processed into the model over time, and by the time the threshold event occurs, you are not experiencing urgency. You are executing a plan that the urgency already built for you. The session's 31 petitioned seats were experiencing urgency. I had experienced it in installments over 9 years and had arrived at the other side of it by the time the shuttle banked over Sarath Veen. The physical profile is reptilian, if you want a shorthand, though the Vithari briefers who gave me the breakdown used 7 more specific descriptors that don't translate cleanly. Amber eyes that catch light at the wrong angles, the way an animal's eyes do when you expect a person's. Scaling along the dorsal ridge in banded amber and slate gray, which is apparently a status marker in ascendancy ranks, though the briefers noted that interpreting status bands requires context they did not have current data on. They move very deliberately, and they do not waste gesture the way some species do. No reflexive signaling, no unconscious tells. You look at a Corvith officer in a visual report, and you feel the particular quality of something that has done this before and is doing it again, and the repetition does not bother it. They had a fleet coordinator named Rethvon whose profile I'd also read. I'll come back to Rethvon. The shuttle landed at the assembly complex's secondary pad. The primary was reserved for Vithari delegations and 3 of the more senior signatory species, which tells you something about the compact's protocol priorities during emergencies. I cleared the receiving corridor with my 2-person staff, a junior attaché named Pelham Voss and a signals specialist named Daria Chen, and we were met by a Vithari protocol officer who introduced herself as Submediator Shale Kethrin. She was the formal grade below the liaisons who would run the actual session, which put her at approximately the level of someone whose job is to make sure the lower priority arrivals reach their assigned gallery positions without incident. She looked at me for a moment longer than the handoff protocol required. Not in the way of someone assessing a threat, more in the way of someone who had expected one category of thing and had received a slightly different one and was taking a moment to update. I was aware of what she would have seen when she reviewed the Earth delegation list ahead of our arrival. 1 commander, 2 staff, 1 document case, no support equipment, no extended communications array. Every other non-compact delegation had arrived with at minimum a 4-person team and a technical specialist for the translation systems. We had the standard liaison configuration because it was a standard liaison session. At least, it was from my side of the document case. I was 39 years old. I am not a large person. I wore the standard Earth liaison uniform, gray, functional, no flash, and carried a document case that was not large, and I had Voss on my left and Chen on my right, and we were the entirety of Earth's formal presence at the session. The Vithari had sent 3 liaison requests in the 10 days preceding the convening, and I had acknowledged each one and confirmed attendance. I had not indicated anything else. Submediator Shale Kethrin guided us up through the complex in the efficient and slightly distracted manner of someone managing 15 things simultaneously, which she probably was. She briefed us on session protocol as we walked: the formal opening, the record convening, the petition reading, the response queue. Earth was listed as the 31st of 31 addressees in the petition sequence. The lowest priority military signatory in the current Compact Alliance architecture, which was an accurate assessment of our formal treaty weight, and which I had noted when the agenda arrived 4 days prior, and had filed without comment. The assembly hall proper was larger than I had expected from the external dimensions. The Vithari build vertically and then hollow the vertical, which means their chambers expand in ways that don't map onto the external footprint. The dome was glass-ribbed, true glass, thick and slightly curved inward at the crown, with a filtering layer that kept the interior at a consistent amber gray rather than the harsh direct light outside. Through the dome you could see sky. Not just sky, 3 of the compact's outer system relay stations were geosynchronous above Sarath Veen, and on a clear day at the right angle you could pick them out as faint points in the atmospheric blue. At the moment they were invisible. Too much cloud cover, too much distance, the wrong angle. I took my seat in the gallery assigned to non-compact signatory liaisons, which was elevated and raked and positioned to see the chamber floor clearly. Voss settled on my left. Chen opened a silent uplink to the signal station we'd established at the Earth compound the day before our arrival. Standard practice. I put the document case on my lap and left it there, closed. The session opened with a formal recording convocation that lasted 9 minutes. The Vithari use their full procedural register at the start of every emergency assembly, which I'd read about but not witnessed. It involves a rhythmic percussion element performed by the session's senior record keepers that carries a specific frequency in the chitinous resonance range that the Vithari themselves can perceive and outsiders mostly cannot. What outsiders perceive is a low vibration in the floor, like distant machinery. It is, the briefing notes explained, not ceremonial in the human sense of the word. It is confirmation of quorum. The Vithari check that they are all present and coherent and capable of binding decisions by means of a frequency that every individual of the species can either produce or perceive in the base register. The fact that outsiders hear it as floor vibration is not an oversight. The session is valid when they say it is valid. I found that I respected this. It is harder to pretend a quorum is complete when your body confirms or denies the count. The petition was read into record by the compact speaker regent, whose name was Vithas Sorrel, a title that actually means something like first voice of the collective need, which you would think sounds theatrical, but in Vithari political structure is functionally closer to what humans would call a civilian emergency coordinator. Vithas Sorrel was old by Vithari reckoning. The blue chitinous plating had the particular quality of having layered over decades, each molt cycle adding density rather than sheen, so that the surface had the appearance of something engineered rather than grown. 4 upper limbs, 2 lower, the usual bilateral arrangement, though the Vithari upper limb range of motion is wider than the schematic in the briefing note suggests. The mandibles were small, folded, doing nothing visible. The eyes, 6, arranged in the forward sweep cluster distinctive to the Vithari dominant caste, tracked the chamber in the specific sweeping pattern I'd been told to expect. Left to right in a complete arc approximately every 4 minutes, as consistent as something mechanical. The petition itself was 27 clauses. I had read it 4 times. It enumerated the situation with a specificity that I think was meant to carry the weight of inevitability. The 3 lost systems, their resource and transit value in cubic lattice compact accounting, the projected corridor exposure if the adjacent system fell, the diplomatic overtures that had gone unanswered, the failed ceasefire framework, the formal ascendancy communication through third-party channel that had used the specific phrase the briefing notes translated as continuation of established advance pattern, which is, in Korath diplomatic register, neither a threat nor a declaration but an administrative notification that they intend to do what they have been doing. You are being informed, not consulted. The distinction matters to the species receiving it. Clause 24 through 26 address the petition terms directly. The compact sought bilateral military partnership arrangements with each of the 31 signatory species, to be formalized under a standard compact mutual defense instrument, with the caveat that the compact acknowledged it could not offer equal return value to all signatories, and was asking each species to make its determination on the basis of shared interest, and whatever it judged its strategic stake to be. That clause, the one that said plainly, "We know we cannot pay you back equally, and we are asking anyway," was the moment I felt the chamber change slightly. The Vithari and the floor-level seats shifted in that particular way that indicates something has been processed as true. Not surprising, exactly. True. They had written an honest petition, which is not always the case when the stakes are this high, and the chamber recognized it. The response queue ran in order of current compact military weight, which put the 4 major signatories first. The Sethrani hegemony, which had a formal mutual defense arrangement already active, confirmed its existing commitment and indicated a willingness to expand the operational scope. That took 8 minutes, including a brief procedural clarification on the scope language. The Davari Syndicate sent a proxy speaker who confirmed a conditional commitment pending supply corridor security guarantees, and then the proxy and the compact's logistics officer spent 22 minutes negotiating the meaning of supply corridor security, in a way that eventually settled into language everyone agreed to log as a qualified yes. The Marathi Commonwealth confirmed with 6 words through a recorded message, which I noted. 6 words. I'll note it again. 6 words from an ally with 200 warships within transit range of the compact's current exposed corridor. 6 words and a commitment. I respected that very much. I watched the chamber between speakers. The Vithari delegation in the floor seats numbered approximately 120, though the exact count varied as individuals cycled through adjacent rooms on what I understood to be a communication rotation. The ones who remained fixed were the senior members of the Compact's Emergency Council, 8 individuals seated at the central dais table, Vitha's sorrel at the head. They were very still. The Vithari stillness is different from human stillness in a way that I've tried to describe before and haven't managed well. Human stillness is the absence of motion. Vithari stillness in a formal session is an active state. The body's energy is directed inward, toward processing, and the surface reads as still the way the surface of a pressurized container reads as still. Something is moving, you're just not the one it's moving for. They watched the proceedings. They watched me periodically. Not openly, the I-sweep arc simply included the gallery at the appropriate interval, which included the gallery position I occupied. But I was aware that after the Marathi Commonwealth 6-word confirmation, the I-sweep interval shortened slightly. Vitha's sorrel specifically. I was 31st on the list and she had started looking at me more often. I didn't change what I was doing, which was sitting with the document case on my lap and my hands folded on top of it, and my posture adjusted for the slightly unusual seat rake of a Vithari gallery bench. Voss was quiet to my left. Chen had something in her earpiece, the faint thread of the signal's uplink, and her hand rested on her knee at an angle that meant the uplink was active and delivering, which I'd asked her to maintain throughout the session. The response queue worked through the remaining signatories over the course of roughly 3 hours. 13 qualified yes commitments, 4 conditional commitments pending specific terms, 7 formal regrets, too far from the front, insufficient military capacity, existing treaty obligations that precluded new arrangements, 4 abstentions framed as deliberation period requests, 2 non-responses, which were logged as such without comment by the record keepers, 1 cancellation, the Vorith Kale Independent Bloc, whose representative had been present at the start of the session and had departed during the 2nd hour, and whose record-keeper notation read simply, "Delegation withdrew prior to response." I had noted their departure. I had noted the direction they departed in, which was not toward the guest transit hub. I had noted the time. That left Earth. The record-keeper called the notation, 31st in sequence, Earth Compact Liaison, Commander Yale Sonnen, Authorized Representative. I said present. Vitha's sorrel looked at me directly for the first time. Not the sweep arc, direct, sustained. All 6 eyes in the forward cluster oriented toward the gallery. The mandibles moved once, a small tightening that the briefing notes described as a formal address preparation signal, the Vithari equivalent of drawing a breath before speaking. she said in formal compact register, which came through my earpiece translated with a half-second lag. Commander Sonnen, Earth is a signatory military species under the Compact Liaison Framework. The Compact formally addresses you in the matter of Clause 24 through 26 of the Emergency Petition and requests your response. The chamber was quiet. 120 Vithari, and the gallery representatives of 7 species who had remained after their own responses, and the 4 record keepers at their stations, and the session monitor who had been standing in the corner for 6 hours and had not moved in the last 2. I opened the document case. There was one folder inside, navy blue, standard Earth Diplomatic Service issue. I had not needed anything else from the case during the session, and I did not need anything else from it now. I removed the folder and I closed the case, and I placed the folder on the gallery railing in front of me, flat, with both hands resting on it for a moment, and then I stood up. "Commander Voss," I said. Voss stood. He was carrying his own copy of what was in the folder, sealed, which I'd given him the night before. He crossed the gallery to the document delivery station, a Vithari procedural feature, a formal physical transfer point for materials entering the session record, and placed his copy in the intake position. I said to Vithas Sorrel and to the chamber, Earth's response to the emergency petition is in the delivery station. I'd ask the record keeper to log the authorization timestamp. The record keeper at the intake station opened Voss's copy. She was a younger Vithari, probably junior cast by the plating density, and I watched her scan the first page and then stop. The mandibles moved. She looked at the page again. She said something in rapid Vithari that the translation system took a moment to process, and what came through my earpiece was a careful, slightly uncertain. The document carries an Earth Diplomatic Service authorization, stamp dated the 11th of this month. The session monitor in the corner looked up. Vithas Sorrel said carefully, "The 11th." "Yes, Speaker Regent." The 11th was 9 days before the session date. I said yes. The deployment order was filed on the 11th. The relevant channels were notified at authorization. I was listed as the notified liaison on record. I paused. The transit timing was calculated from the 11th. The chamber was quiet for a different quality now than it had been during the response queue. The response queue quiet had been attentive. This was something else. I had been in chambers when the quality changed like that, when the room's working model of the situation had been revised by a single piece of information, and the revision was still propagating, and the Vithari version of it had a specific signature. The I-sweep arc stalled. Multiple individuals simultaneously losing the rhythm of the arc because the thing they were processing was demanding more allocation than the routine sweep. The chitinous plating across the floor seats showed that fractional micro-motion I'd noted earlier in Vithas Sorrel. The spacing between the plates changing slightly. The whole body tension of a species integrating something that didn't fit its prior model. I kept my posture neutral. My hands were at my sides. I had delivered the document and I was waiting to answer procedural questions, which is the role the session protocol assigned me, and I saw no reason to do anything other than that. Vithas Sorrel said, after a pause I measured at approximately 15 seconds, "Commander Sonnen, you are indicating that Earth military forces are currently in transit." "Yes, Speaker Regent." "Dispatched 9 days ago." "Yes." "Before the session convened." "Yes." She was not asking these as questions in the way the translation conveyed them. She was running a verification sequence, checking the statement against itself at multiple angles, which is a Vithari reasoning method for things that are difficult to integrate quickly. The mandibles made the tightening motion again and held. She said, "Before the petition was formally received by Earth's liaison office." I said, "We received a preliminary intelligence report on the 4th. The deployment order was filed 7 days later." I said it the way you say things that are simply true and don't require decoration. The petition arrived on the 14th. The record will show we acknowledged receipt on the same day. The 4 record keepers were all looking at their own stations now. 3 of them were cross-checking something. The 4th was reading the deployment order in full, which I'd expected. It was 12 pages of operational logistics and authorization chain and force composition summary, and it was written clearly enough that a Vithari record keeper with compact military integration experience could parse the relevant sections without a translation specialist. I had written it with that in mind. When you put a document in a routing queue 9 days before it needs to be understood by someone in a formal session, you write it so it will be understood quickly in a formal session. Vita Sorrel said, "What is the force composition?" It's in the order. Page 4 and 5 cover the primary elements. One of the other council members at the central dais table, a Vithari I placed as senior cast by the plating, with the particular amber spectrum eye coloring that the briefing notes associated with the compact's defense advisory function, leaned to his left and said something in rapid Vithari to the record keeper nearest him. She responded. He looked at me. I looked back. He said, in the deliberate compact formal register that indicates the speaker is choosing to use the trade register tongue rather than their own, "Commander Sonnen." The order references Class 18 designation for the originating command structure. I said yes. Earth's homeworld is logged in the compact species registry as Class 14. Homeworld, yes. He waited. I said, the command structure originating this deployment is based on Corvith Station. Corvith is Class 18. The exchange at the central dais table that followed happened in Vithari, which the translation system rendered with some delay, and with the particular quality of something that is technically accurate but missing register. What came through was approximately the advisory member saying to Vita Sorrel that a Class 18 command structure meant the operational personnel were rated for that environment, and Vita Sorrel responding that she was aware of what it meant, and the advisory member saying something that the translation system rendered as the force classification figure on page 5, and Vita Sorrel saying something that the translation system declined to render precisely, but tagged as a formal acknowledgement register phrase. Which means the speaker regent said something that closed the topic without inviting further discussion. She turned back to me. She said, "Commander Sonnen, does Earth anticipate a formal alliance instrument, or is this deployment offered under a different framework?" I said, the deployment order references the Compact's standard mutual defense framework in the authorization clause. Earth is willing to formalize under whatever structure the Compact prefers. The session monitor in the corner wrote something in his log. I could not see what. The record keeper at the intake station had reached page 7 of the deployment order and had stopped moving. Not the stopping of someone who has encountered a problem. The stopping of someone who has encountered a figure they need to look at more than once before they are confident in the reading. Through the glass-ribbed dome, the sky over Sarath Veen had shifted slightly, late afternoon, the filtering layer adjusting. The relay stations were still invisible. Something else was not. Chen touched my elbow, very lightly, the way she did when the signal's uplink was delivering something she needed me to know about. I kept my eyes on the chamber floor. She leaned close and said, very quietly, "Transit confirmation just came through. Lead elements are in the approach corridor." The approach corridor for Sarath Veen's orbital architecture sat at the edge of the atmosphere, which from the surface means the glass-ribbed dome is your best view of anything on that vector. The Vithari dome is not a viewport in the architectural sense. It is a structural feature that admits light, not observation, but it admits enough to make shapes visible when the shapes are large enough and close enough, and positioned at the right angle relative to the afternoon light. 4 of the Vithari in the floor seats saw it before the gallery did. I knew because the eye-sweep arcs changed. Not the stalling of the earlier moment, but a coordinated reorientation, the forward clusters swinging in the same direction simultaneously, which in any species reads as everyone has just found the same thing. I did not look up, I knew what was there. Vitha's Sorrel looked up. She held the position for a long moment, the 6-eye cluster angled toward the dome, the upper limbs very still, the mandibles not moving. I watched her the way I watch anyone processing something that is revising their model of the situation in real time, the specific quality of stillness that is not composure but the processing that precedes it. The Vithari have a particular tell at this stage that the briefing notes described but that I'd not seen in practice before, which is a shift in the dorsal plating micromotion. The plates themselves do not move, but the spacing between them changes fractionally, the way a mammalian species might have a change in muscle tension across the shoulders, visible if you know to look for it. Vitha's Sorrel had that. Several of the council members at the central dais table had that. Then Vitha's Sorrel looked back at me. She said, "Commander Sonnen." I said, "Speaker Regent." She said, "The lead elements of the deployment." I said, "Yes." "How many are in approach?" The order lists the advance formation on page 4. Full array follows at the intervals on page 5. She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, to the chamber record keeper in formal Vithari, "Log Earth's response as received and confirmed." She paused. "Log the deployment order as authorized documentation under the emergency petition record. Log the authorization date as the 11th. The record keeper said, "Logged, Speaker Regent." I sat back down. Voss sat down beside me. Chin's hand came off my elbow. The session moved into a procedural adjournment sequence that is standard for Vithari emergency assemblies after all petition responses have been recorded. A formal acknowledgement sweep, some record verification, a brief physical recess. I used the recess to stand and stretch, which gallery protocol permits, and I looked up through the dome for the first time since the signal's confirmation. I will try to describe this without overselling it, because overselling it would get the temperature wrong, and the temperature is the point. An Earth military formation in approach configuration occupies more of the sky than you expect. It is not that the individual vessels are visible as distinct shapes at that distance. They are not, or not quite, not to the naked eye. What you see is the effect of them, the way the light bends at the edges of the formation, the way the afternoon sky over Sereth Veen had the particular quality of a room that has someone in it you hadn't noticed before. A presence registered as atmospheric before it was registered as specific. The filtering layer of the dome softened the direct light, and through it the formation read as a density, a weight, a shadow that was not casting shadows because it was above the light source plane. You have to look at it for a moment before your eyes confirm what they are telling you. The Vithari have a phrase. I'd found it in one of the cultural briefing annexes and had been waiting to understand it in context. That translates approximately as the arrival of the thing that was already decided. It doesn't mean something inevitable. It means something that completed its decision-making cycle out of view and is now visible for the first time, and the phrase describes the specific quality of encountering it, the sensation of a process that finished before you were present for it. I think that was the quality in the chamber when the eye-sweep arc stalled and then reoriented toward the dome. They were not seeing something arrive. They were seeing something that had already arrived become visible. The Vithari in the floor seats were looking up. The gallery representatives of the other species were looking up. The session monitor had come out of his corner and was standing at the edge of the chamber floor with his log closed. One of the Vithari record keepers had set down her notation instrument entirely, and her forward eye cluster was oriented toward the dome and had not moved for 30 seconds. I looked at the formation for a reasonable amount of time, and then I looked back at the chamber. Voss was looking at the dome with an expression I recognized. The expression of someone who has known something for 9 days and is watching other people encounter it for the first time. It is a particular expression, not superior, more like watching a letter arrive that you wrote a long time ago and had almost forgotten about. The particular quality of a thing completed becoming visible to people who did not know it was being built. Chen had the uplink going. She said, quiet. Reth Vaughn's communications office filed a channel request at 1452. I looked at her. She said, Korath Ascendancy, Fleet Coordinator Reth Vaughn, requested a contact channel to the Earth Military Liaison Office at Sarath Veen, filed through the Compact's third-party routing, not directly. She paused. 43 minutes ago. 43 minutes ago was before the session reached Earth in the response queue. 43 minutes ago, Reth Vaughn had been tracking the approach corridor. I said, log the request received. Standard holding acknowledgement. I'll decide on timing after the session closes. Chen logged it. The recess ended, and the session reconvened for the formal closing sequence. Vitha's Sorrel moved through the acknowledgement clauses with the particular efficiency of someone who has been in the procedural sequences long enough that the language is automatic and the attention is elsewhere. She confirmed the received commitments by category. She logged the conditional commitments with their attached terms. She noted the abstentions and non-responses. When she reached the Earth entry in the record, she read it into the formal close simply as Earth Diplomatic Service Deployment Order filed 11th of this month, confirmed in session under the Emergency Petition record. Compact acknowledges. That was all she said about it in the formal close, which was the right amount. Afterward, in the adjournment corridor, the Vithari transitional space between the chamber and the receiving area, all curved blue stone and the low ambient resonance frequency still faintly present in the walls, submediator Shale Catherine found me. She was no longer managing 15 things simultaneously. She was managing one, which was the conversation she wanted to have with me, and she stopped in front of me in the corridor and stood there for a moment with the mandibles doing something I didn't have a briefing note for. I waited. She said in the trade register tongue rather than formal Vithari, Commander Sonnen. You have been at this posting for 11 months. I said yes. She said, the 4th, when your intelligence assessment reached you, was 9 days before the session, but the Korath's move against the Vasith-Kalar corridor was 12 days before the session. The Vasith-Kalar corridor was the third outer system, the one that had completed the sequence that made the petition necessary. I said, we track the corridors. She looked at me for a moment. You were watching the Korath advance before we sent the petition. We track all relevant advance activity in the Compact's operational theater. That's the liaison function. She said, with the careful quality of someone assembling a statement they want to be accurate. You dispatched the deployment before we asked. I said, the intelligence assessment indicated the corridor exposure was at the threshold. The deployment order was filed when the assessment crossed that threshold. A pause. She said, you didn't tell us. I thought about how to answer that. I said, the deployment order was filed with the relevant notifications. Your communications desk at the Compact received the authorization record on the 11th. It was in the standard liaison routing. She was quiet. Then she said, the standard liaison routing. Yes. She looked at me in the way of someone who has just understood that a document they thought was administrative had been something else entirely, and who is deciding how to feel about that. I did not help her with the feeling. It was hers to have. What I did not say, because it would have been both true and unkind to say it directly. We had sent the notification through standard routing because we wanted it to arrive as routine. A deployment order in the standard liaison traffic reads as logistics. It does not generate the response that a direct advance notice generates. It does not trigger the counter-analysis, the external scrutiny, the political calculation about what it means that Earth was moving. It arrives, gets logged, and waits until someone checks the routing queue and realizes what it is. We had put it in the queue 9 days before the session because we wanted the fleet in the approach corridor before anyone outside the compact's primary communications desk had time to process what the routing queue said. Reth Vaughn had been faster than I'd expected. 43 minutes before the session reached Earth slot. But by 43 minutes before the session reached Earth slot, the formation was already in the approach corridor, and the approach corridor is inside the compact's operational boundary. And inside that boundary, the mathematics of the situation was not Reth Vaughn's to negotiate with. I said to Submediator Shale Catherine, "Your communications desk should have the full operational log in the liaison routing queue, dated from the 11th. If you want the record reviewed, that's the place to start." She looked at me for another moment, then she said, "I'll review it." I said, "Good." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with the quality of something considered rather than reflexive, "The Vorith Kale delegation left before the response queue reached the second tier." I said, "I noticed." She said, "Their primary council seat has a signals arrangement with the Korath Ascendancy. It's not formal. It's not documented. We've tracked it for 6 months." I said, "I know." The mandibles moved again. "You know?" "Yes." "And you didn't." "It's in the signals intercept file in the liaison routing queue," I said, "dated from 3 months ago, referenced in the Deployment Order's Strategic Assessment Annex, page 8. She had not reached page 8 yet. I said, "When you review the routing queue, check the intercept file. The Vorith Kale's signals pattern is documented there. We've been tracking the timing. Their notification to the Korath of major compact assembly events was running approximately 30 minutes ahead of the formal public scheduling announcement. Today, they would have notified earlier than usual, given the emergency convening. The 43-minute window on Reth Vaughn's channel request is consistent with a notification sent before the session opened." Submediator Shale Catherine was very still. I said, "The intercept file includes 6 months of the pattern. It's documented. What you do with it is a compact decision." She said after a long moment, "Commander Sonnen." I waited. She said, "How long have you been watching all of this?" I thought about the honest answer. The honest answer was 11 months, which was the duration of the posting. But that was the period I had been watching this specific theater. The institutional answer, the answer that accounted for the people whose work had preceded mine, the analysts and the signals officers and the liaison staff at the 4 prior postings who had built the assessment architecture I was operating within, was longer, much longer. The compact's Korath exposure had been flagged in Earth's intelligence traffic for 9 years. The Vorith Kale signals pattern had a precursor analysis from before I was posted here. The deployment order I filed on the 11th drew on 3 layers of prior work. The signals intercept data, the corridor exposure threshold modeling that the Corvith Station analysts had been refining for 6 years, and the force availability survey that the Corvith command structure completes on a rolling quarterly basis. I had read all of it. I had been reading the relevant sections since week 2 of the posting, because that is how you do the liaison function correctly. You read everything that your predecessors built before you start adding to it. I said, "A while." She looked at me, then she looked at the floor, then she looked back at me. She said, "We petitioned 31 species." I said, "Yes." "We didn't know. We weren't sure anyone would." I said, "You got 13 qualified yes responses and 4 conditionals. That's a real answer." She was quiet. I said, "And the deployment is in the approach corridor." She said quietly, "Yes, it is." I picked up the document case. I'll be at the Earth compound for the rest of the evening if the compact has follow-on procedural questions. I'll respond to Reth Vaughn's channel request in the morning, after I've confirmed the formation positioning with the lead element command. I paused. That confirmation will determine the meeting parameters. She said, "You're going to meet with them." I said, "It's a channel request. I'll respond to it." "What will you say?" I said, "I'll find out what they want to say." I picked up the case. "They filed through a third-party channel, not directly. That's a specific choice. It means they want to communicate without the communication being formal. I'll hear what they want to communicate." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And if what they want to communicate is that they'll proceed anyway?" I said, "Then they'll have communicated that, and we'll have the communication logged, and the situation will be what it is." I said it evenly. "The formation is in the approach corridor, submediator. The mathematics of the situation is not affected by what Reth Vaughn decides to communicate." She looked at me for a long moment. The ambient resonance from the chamber was still present in the walls of the corridor, barely perceptible. That low frequency the Vithari used to confirm they are all present and coherent and capable of binding decisions. I was aware of it in the way you become aware of background sound when the conversation pauses. She said, "The formation is there because you filed an order 9 days ago." I said, "Yes." She said, "Before we asked." I said, "Yes." The mandibles did the thing I didn't have a briefing note for. Then she said, in the careful way of someone stating something they want to state correctly, "We didn't know whether anyone would come." I said, "I know." She said, "You came before we asked." I said, "The corridor exposure was at the threshold." She was quiet, then she said, "Is that the whole answer?" I thought about it. I said, "It's the accurate answer." I said good evening to submediator Shale Kethrin, and I walked out through the receiving area to the pad where the shuttle was waiting. On the way across the tarmac, Voss came up beside me and Chen flanked my right, and the city of Sereth Veen was cooling into the late afternoon around us, the blue stone taking on the reddish cast that the Vithari capital gets in the lower light, and through the upper atmosphere in the approach corridor, the formation was there. Invisible from the tarmac at this angle, but there. Reth Vaughn's channel request was in the queue. I'd respond in the morning, when the positioning was confirmed and the parameters were clear. The Korath were patient, methodical people with 400 years of advance behind them, and I respected that in a specific and precise way, the way you respect any well-calibrated thing operating within a model it has not yet had cause to revise. But the approach corridor was inside the compact's operational boundary, and the deployment order had been filed on the 11th, and the formation was there. That is the whole shape of it. They petitioned 31 seats. 13 said yes and 4 said conditionally, and 7 said no, and the Vorithkale left early to make a call, and the Earth military liaison to the Vithari compact sat in the gallery with a document case on her lap and waited for the session to reach her slot. The document inside the case was 12 pages, and it was dated 9 days prior, and it was the only document in the case because it was the only document that needed to be there. I responded to Reth Vaughn's channel request at 8:15 the next morning. He asked, in the careful formal register of the Korath Diplomatic Service, whether Earth's current positioning constituted a formal opposition to the Ascendancy's advance activity in the compact's outer corridors. I said that Earth's positioning was described in full in the deployment order, which was filed under the compact's emergency petition record and available through the public documentation channel. He said that the deployment order described military disposition, but not intent. I said that military disposition and intent were the same document. He was quiet for a moment in the way that Korath officers, from what I had read of them, are quiet when they are revising the situation model. The profile I had read noted that the Korath senior officer cadre has a specific behavioral signature during model revision, a cessation of subvocalization that produces a particular kind of channel silence, not dead air but something that carries the quality of processing rather than hesitation. Reth Vaughn's silence had that quality. I let it have time. Then he asked whether Earth was in contact with the other signatory species, who had confirmed commitments. I said that was a question about the Compact's internal communications, and he should direct it to the Compact's liaison office. He said, Commander Sonnen, the Ascendancy's advanced doctrine has maintained a consistent pattern for 400 years. I said, I know. He said, the pattern does not account for this variable. I said, I know. He was quiet again. Then he said, with the careful, deliberate quality that in the intelligence profile I'd read was described as the Korath Senior Officer Register for formal acknowledgement, the Ascendancy will require time to incorporate the variable into the assessment framework. I said, that's reasonable. He said, we would appreciate a stable operational environment during that period. I said, the deployment order describes Earth's operational parameters. The formation is positioned in the approach corridor in accordance with those parameters. It will remain there. I paused. The Compact's liaison office can provide additional detail on the mutual defense framework, if that's useful for the Ascendancy's assessment period. He said he would contact the Compact's liaison office. I said that was a good place to start. The channel closed at 8:31. I filed the contact record to the standard routing queue and sent the log copy to Chen for the signals archive. And then I sat at the desk in the Earth Compound's liaison office with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold, and looked at the morning light coming through the window, and thought about nothing in particular for about 4 minutes, which is approximately what it takes for the calibration to settle after a contact session. Not a debrief, not an analysis, just the 4 minutes of nothing that lets the conversation recede from the front of your processing, so you can file it accurately rather than filing the version that still has your own temperature in it. The Korath Ascendancy's advance halted at the outer corridor boundary that month. The formal ceasefire framework was filed 6 weeks later through the Compact's mediation channel. Reth Vaughn's signals office sent one more communication to the Earth liaison desk 3 days after the ceasefire filing. Not a channel request, not a formal document, just a brief notation through the standard routing that the Ascendancy's assessment framework had been updated to reflect the current operational variable. I filed it in the routing queue. The formation held position in the approach corridor for the duration of the ceasefire negotiation, 41 days. Then it transited to the Korvath station holding pattern, which is where it had come from, and the approach corridor returned to standard atmospheric. Submediator Shale Kethrin sent a formal communication to the Earth Diplomatic Service Office on day 3 after the ceasefire filing. It was a thank you note, which is not a standard Vithari diplomatic instrument. The standard instruments are acknowledgments and formal recognitions and record entries. A thank you note is not a Vithari thing. She had written it in the trade register tongue rather than formal Vithari, which means it was for the recipient and not for the record. She said, among other things, we did not know whether anyone would come. I wrote back, I said, the corridor exposure was at the threshold. She wrote back once more, she said, that is the accurate answer, but I asked if it was the whole one. I thought about that for a day, then I wrote it's both. I have been at the Sarath Veen posting for 14 months now, and the Compact's outer corridor assessment is stable, and the Vorithkale signals arrangement with the Korath Ascendancy has been a matter of formal record since the Compact's internal review completed, and the routing queue at the Earth Liaison Office is very well organized. I reread the deployment order occasionally, which I know sounds strange, but the authorization chain is clean, and the Strategic Assessment Annex still holds, and there is something about a document that says what it means before the situation requires it to say anything that I find worth returning to. The 11th, 9 days before the session, the intelligence assessment crossed the threshold and the order was filed, and the fleet was in transit before any of us said a word in that chamber. The formation appeared above the dome at the moment it appeared above the dome, because we had been watching the corridors. That's the whole answer.